What are you? Completely stupid. The red wine glasses should be on the left. Caroline clucked her tongue irritably as she watched another maid fidget with the crystal glasses. God, where do they get you poor people like this? Her contemptuous gaze, calibrated by years of training at the mirror, slid down the hall of the luxurious Los Angeles mansion. A crucial reception was to be held here today. Her husband was expecting the Chinese investors on whom the future of his business depended. Caroline was worried about that too, but she was also worried about whether the guest would be impressed by her new dress from a famous designer at an insane price. She once again meticulously examined her reflection in the huge Venetian mirror. Yes, everything was perfect. Years of modeling in a small town hadn't gone to waste. She knew exactly how to present herself. Amy. She snapped her fingers, beckoning the maid over. Are you done with the flowers? Amy, a woman in her early 40s in a strict uniform, looked up with a calm gaze. Yes, Mrs. Caroline. The roses are arranged exactly as you asked. Asked? Caroline splashed her hands. I demanded it. Don't you know the difference? She walked over to the nearest vase. And this is what you call a composition? Any village grandmother would have done a better job. Damn servants, Caroline thought, nervously adjusting her already impeccable $5,000 styling. Especially that new girl, Amy, always walking around with her dignity as if she weren't a maid, but at least a countess in exile. Well, I'll put you in your place tonight. Caroline had made special preparations for this evening. She was sure that the Chinese, with their Oriental mentality, would appreciate her ability to keep her servants in line. Let them see that she was dealing with serious people and not with some upstart, she reasoned, not noticing the irony of life in her own thoughts. By evening, the mansion was filled with the hum of voices and the clinking of glasses. The Chinese guests, solid men in expensive suits, were talking to Jonathan through an interpreter. Caroline glided between the groups of guests, exuding rehearsed charm. Around her chiseled neck was a necklace with a huge sapphire, a gift from her husband for her last birthday. Look, everyone, how lucky I am to have a husband, she said with every gesture, every turn of her head. Out of the corner of her eye, she spotted Amy serving drinks, and a wicked grin curved her lips. She waited until the maid passed the table with the important guests. A slight, almost imperceptible movement of her elbow, and the tray in Amy's hands shook. The snow-white napkins were fanning across the floor at the feet of the Chinese partners. Oh my God! Caroline was instantly at the center of the scene. What are you doing? These are important guests. Her voice was ringing with feigned indignation. What if you had drinks in your hands? Do you realize how much Mr. Lee's suit cost? More than you'll earn in your whole miserable life. An awkward silence hung in the hall. Amy knelt silently, gathering her napkins. She appeared particularly defenseless at this moment, but there was still some inexplicable dignity in her movements. No, look at her. Caroline turned to the guests, reveling in her power. She won't even apologize. She thinks she's too important. And I took her in out of pity, by the way. People like her should be grateful that they are given a job in a decent house at all. The guests looked at each other in confusion. Jonathan, standing a little further away, frowned, clearly unhappy with his wife's behavior. He wanted to intervene, but he knew too well Caroline's temper. Any comment would only make things worse. Well? Caroline raised her voice. I'm waiting. Apologize to the visiting gentleman. Amy slowly rose from her knees. There was no fear or anger in her eyes, just a calm steel. And then the unexpected happened. In flawless Chinese, Amy uttered a long, ornate phrase. Her voice sounded soft and melodious, as if she were reciting an ancient Oriental poem. At the end, she bowed her head slightly in a graceful bow, clearly demonstrating an excellent knowledge of local etiquette. There was dead silence in the hall. Caroline froze with her mouth open, and her carefully applied makeup could not conceal the blotches of anger. The Chinese guests stared at the humble maid in amazement, and Mr. Lee's eyes showed genuine interest. This woman in a simple maid's uniform was clearly not who she claimed to be. The silence literally rang out. The Chinese guests looked at the humble maid with undisguised interest. Mr. Lee said something softly to his colleagues, and there was a genuine respect in his voice. They nodded in agreement, clearly impressed by what was happening. Even young Van, who had been a bit haughty all evening, now looked at Amy with undisguised curiosity. Caroline froze with a face twisted with rage, unable to believe what was happening. Her glossy fingers, studded with expensive rings, nervously fiddled with the lace on her dress. This moment, which should have been her triumph, had turned into humiliation. Jonathan, sensing something in the changed atmosphere, nodded softly to Amy, giving her permission to leave. She walked slowly out of the hall, still maintaining her dignity in every movement. "Please, gentlemen," Jonathan gestured for the guests to continue the evening, trying to smooth over the awkwardness of the moment. Exquisite dishes replaced each other on a table decorated with the finest china and crystal. Expensive wine was flowing. A relaxed conversation started. The interpreter barely had time to transmit the lines from both sides. They talked about hunting, about the weather in Beijing, about Chinese food. Caroline, quickly pulling herself together, shone again, showering compliments left and right. But her smile did not touch her eyes, in which lurked a poorly concealed anxiety. Every now and then she cast wary glances at the door behind which Amy had disappeared. The soft light of the chandeliers created a cozy atmosphere, but the air in the room still seemed electrified. Something subtly changed after that scene. The Chinese guests, though making small talk, were clearly immersed in their own thoughts. They often spoke to each other in their own language, and each time Caroline flinched as if expecting a blow. When the conversation began to turn to business, Mr. Lee suddenly uttered a long sentence, glancing every now and then towards the door behind which Amy had disappeared. His fingers thoughtfully stroked the amber rosary beads, a gesture Jonathan had already noticed as a sign of the elderly Chinese man's particular agitation. "Mr. Lee is wondering," the interpreter began, "if we could invite your employee, who speaks Chinese so beautifully, to join our conversation?" Jonathan was slightly confused, but quickly managed his surprise. "Of course," he beckoned to the butler. "Invite Amy, please." The minutes of waiting dragged on for an agonizingly long time. Caroline sat as if on pins and needles, her manicured fingers tapping nervously on the table. Finally, the doors opened. Amy stepped into the hall. She had changed into a modest but elegant dark dress, and now, without her maid's uniform, she looked completely different. There was something subtly aristocratic about her. "Please, sit down." Jonathan pointed to an empty seat at the table. Caroline jerked as if slapped, but didn't dare object. The deal was too important to their family. "It's okay," she thought, glaring at Amy's back. "I'll deal with you later." The Chinese guest stirred. Mr. Lee asked something, and Amy answered him in Chinese. A lively conversation ensued. "What are they talking about?" Caroline gritted her teeth, clutching at her husband's sleeve. Her perfect makeup could no longer hide the patches of nervous blush on her cheeks. The interpreter, listening, began to explain. "Mr. Lee asks about the work in your house. Your maid replies that the staff are well treated here, tells how you, Jonathan Andrew, helped with the treatment of the mother of one of the maids. As always fair with the employees." Jonathan listened to the translation with increasing interest. He himself had almost forgotten that incident with the maid's ailing mother. He had just done what he thought was right, but Amy remembered, and not just remembered. She saw his true nature in that act. A slight smile appeared on his face. "It's nice to be recognized and appreciated for what you do." The conversation flowed casually. Amy held herself with surprising tact, without a trace of ingratiation or arrogance. It was as if she had been sitting at such tables and talking to important businessmen all her life. The Chinese clearly appreciated not only her language but also her manners. "What do you think of the company's business?" Young partner Wang asked, pouring himself some red wine. Amy shook her head and replied something in Chinese, bowing her head slightly. "She says it's out of her purview," the translator translated, but adds that where the manager treats people with respect and business is conducted fairly. Mr. Lee nodded contentedly, fiddling with his amber rosary beads. For the Chinese, Jonathan noticed, this conversation clearly had a special meaning. It was as if they were checking not so much the prospects of a deal as the human qualities of a possible partner. "What can you say about the lady of the house?" Van suddenly asked, looking intently at Amy. A palpable tension hung in the air. Caroline drew herself up like a predator before a leap. A shadow flashed in Amy's eyes. She lowered her gaze for a moment, then uttered a short sentence. What? What did she say? Caroline's voice rang with excitement. The translator faltered. She said that some things are best left untold. After dinner, as the guests began to leave, Caroline caught up with Amy in the empty corridor. Her sallow face contorted with anger, all traces of ostentatious hospitality gone without a trace. You, she hissed, digging her manicured nails into Amy's sleeve. How dare you? You think because you know their language you're special now? I'm going to destroy you. You're out of here without references. You'll be eating my slop. Jonathan's loud voice silenced her half-heartedly. Stop it. Amy, would you please come into my office? The spacious room smelled of expensive tobacco and leather. The heavy curtains dimmed the light from the street lamps, giving the room an air of privacy. Jonathan sank tiredly into a chair. I'm sorry about my wife's behavior. I didn't even realize you spoke Chinese. How? Amy perched on the edge of the proffered chair. There was a familiar shadow of sadness in her eyes that Jonathan had noticed many times before, but only now was beginning to understand its cause. I lived in China for 5 years, she began quietly. My husband worked there as a tour guide for American tourists. We were happy. She was quiet for a moment, gathering her composure. We had a little house by the sea, not far from Beijing. I learned the language, immersed myself in their culture. Everything was great, she stammered, but picked herself up and continued. Until he died. He lost control on a mountain serpentine. After that I couldn't stay there and returned home. So why didn't you find work as an interpreter with such language skills? Jonathan asked. I needed time, Amy replied quietly. Just time to recover. Working in your house was so fortunate. It helped me forget. You know, it gets easier when you're busy all day doing simple, straightforward things. She raised her eyes to Jonathan. You're a good man, Jonathan Andrew. A fair one. I noticed that right away. There was some rustling outside the office door. Caroline, who had been eavesdropping on the conversation, recoiled from the door and quickly clomped her heels down the corridor. Her mind was spinning feverishly. This upstart could ruin everything. Something had to be done, and fast. There was too much she could know, too much she could tell. Night was descending on the luxurious mansion, enveloping it in shadows. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of the Chinese guests' cars driving away could be heard. That evening had changed many things, though none of the people involved had any idea how much. The next morning, Jonathan listened in amazement to the strange conditions of the Chinese partners, relayed through an interpreter. Mr. Lee insists on including Mrs. Amy on the negotiating team. They believe her knowledge of the language and culture will be invaluable to the project. Jonathan hated to lose a good domestic worker, but there was no choice. Too much depended on this deal. He summoned Amy to his office and explained the situation. She listened in silence, only turning slightly pale. I realize this is unexpected, Jonathan looked at her carefully, but we really need you. I agree, the woman replied simply. Only, she faltered, you'll have to wait a while. I don't have the right clothes for this kind of meeting. Jonathan immediately gave her a generous advance, and within a week Amy was working in her new capacity. Now she appeared in the office in a strict business suit, neatly styled, but still modest and dignified. Caroline, noticing this change, was as if off the chain. She tried to comment sarcastically on the former maid's new status, or pretended not to notice her at all. But most importantly, she was always hovering around the conference room, trying to catch a glimpse of what Jonathan and Amy were talking about. And there was a lot to talk about. Amy was more than just a translator. She was well versed in the subtleties of Chinese etiquette and knew how to structure a conversation, what to talk about at once and what topics to postpone. More and more often, Jonathan found himself admiring her not as a woman, of course, but as a professional. One evening, when everyone had already left, Amy was in the office checking her documents. Suddenly, Caroline appeared in the doorway. There was no trace of her usual glamorous demeanor. Before Amy stood a predator, ready to pounce. Her eyes glinted dangerously in the semi-darkness of the office, and her perfect fingernails tapped nervously on the door jamb. "You think you're so smart?" she muttered through gritted teeth. "Determined to gain my husband's trust? I see the way you look at him, the way you hang around him all day long." "I'm just doing my job," Amy replied calmly, though her heart raced. "Oh, really?" Caroline slowly stepped closer, her heels clattering on the parquet floor. She rested her hands on the table and leaned towards Amy. "You know, the roads are so dangerous everywhere. Not just in China. One wrong turn and it's family time." She paused, reveling in the effect of her words. "Really, you don't have a family anymore? What a shame." Amy felt nausea coming up to her throat. This wasn't just a hint anymore. "What do you mean by that?" Her voice treacherously shook. "Oh, nothing much." Caroline straightened, examining her flawless manicure. "Just sharing observations. You know, accidents, they're so unfortunate, aren't they? Serpentines, they're treacherous everywhere, even around Los Angeles. Especially in the rain." She smiled meaningfully. "Be careful on the roads, dear. And don't stick your nose where it doesn't belong." At that moment, a door slammed somewhere. Caroline turned round abruptly and stormed out of the study, pulling on a social smile as she went. Amy remained seated, struggling to control the trembling in her hands. Scraps of conversations she had overheard once before came to mind. "Yes, it's all set. The account is in a different name. No, he doesn't know anything." It was Caroline's voice from her office when Amy was dusting the corridor as a maid. "After the deal with the Chinese, we can close it all down for good." A phone conversation overheard during the cleanup. $50 million. "Yes, all offshore." A whisper in an empty living room. At the time, these phrases had seemed merely odd, but now everything was coming together in an eerie mosaic. Caroline's obsession with this Chinese deal was particularly alarming. It was as if she were rushing it, pushing things along. And then there were those strange encounters with some man in a cafe. Amy had seen them twice when she'd gone home for groceries. Amy drove in confusion behind the wheel of her second-hand foreign car. She glanced in the rearview mirror every now and then. Caroline's words about dangerous roads never left her mind. At one corner, she thought she saw a dark SUV following her, and she nervously turned down another street. Amy knew she had to tell Jonathan about her suspicions, but how could she do it without ruining the deal that would determine the future of the company? And more importantly, how to prove it all? After all, she only had scraps of conversation, overheard phrases, but her intuition screamed, delay could cost too much. And she wasn't the only one. After a sleepless night, Amy made a decision. It was Friday, the last day of work before signing the contract with the Chinese. It was now or never, she thought, standing in front of Jonathan's office door. "Come in," came the reply to her knock. Jonathan was sitting at his desk, studying some papers. He looked up and smiled. "Amy, come in. I wanted to go over the details of tomorrow's meeting with you." "Jonathan Andrew," she interrupted him, gathering her resolve. "I'm sorry, but there's something I need to tell you. Something very important." He raised his eyebrows in surprise and gestured for her to sit down. Amy," she stammered for a second, but then the words flowed. "I overheard some conversations when I was still working as a maid." Caroline's conversations. About some accounts, offshore, about money. "I didn't pay much attention to it at first, but now." She told him everything. The overheard phone conversations, the strange encounters in the cafe, Caroline's threats. Jonathan's face grew darker with each word. "Do you have proof?" he asked after a long silence. "Only what I've heard. And also this." She pulled a phone out of her purse. "Yesterday, after Caroline's threats, I switched on the voice recorder. Just in case." When the recording ended, Jonathan rose slowly from the table and walked to the window. Behind him was the click of the door closing. They turned round in sync. Caroline was standing in the study. "What a touching scene," she stretched out with a feigned smile. "Darling, once again that upstart is messing with your head. Where's the money, Caroline?" Jonathan's voice sounded unexpectedly firm. "What money, honey?" She splayed her hands picturesquely. "Do you really believe that, Maid?" Caroline curled her lips contemptuously. Stop it. Jonathan cut her short. I've felt for a long time that something was wrong. Vanishing sums, strange transactions. I wrote it off to accounting errors, anything. I didn't want to believe it. And rightly so. Caroline stepped toward him. It's all hexes, honey. That woman is just trying to get us into a fight. You see how she is, don't you? I see everything. Jonathan pulled a folder from his desk drawer. Especially now. You know what's in here. He shook the folder in the air. Statements from all the accounts, including the one you've been hiding so diligently. Caroline went pale. Have you been following me? No. It's just that after that thing with the Chinese, I started looking around more closely. And you know what I saw? His voice turned icy. That my wife was systematically bankrupting my company. 5 years, Caroline. 5 years you've been withdrawing money, and I've been like a blind man. You can't prove anything, she suddenly went on the offensive. You think I didn't have insurance? All the documents are clean. All the signatures. Forged, Amy said quietly. Caroline turned sharply towards her. What did you say? The signatures are forged, Amy repeated. I've seen you practice forging them. In your office when you thought no one could see. I also heard you talking about the Chinese deal. You rushed it on purpose so you could get the last large sum out in time to finally bring the company down. Shut up. Caroline shrieked. You don't know anything. Do you think it's easy being a rich man's wife? All the appointments, the smiles, the eternal pretense. I've earned that money. Deserve it? Jonathan grinned bitterly. You mean you admit it? Caroline faltered as she realized she had spoken. Her sallow face contorted with rage. All right. I took what was owed to me. You've been living just fine all these years, never needing anything. So what? A couple of million. A couple of million. Jonathan opened the folder. There's over $20 million withdrawn here. You almost destroyed my life's work. Over $20 million. You almost destroyed my life's work. Caroline snorted contemptuously. Who needs it? Your business? Your first wife's son is chilling in London. All you need is a job. And me? I'm a young woman. I want to live on someone else's dime. Would you? Jonathan asked quietly. Caroline suddenly calmed down. A serpentine smile slid across her lips. Just you know what, sweetheart, there's nothing you can do. I have all the documents, all the proof. You're wrong, Amy's voice came up again. I made copies of all the documents I found and put them in the right hands. What did you say? Caroline turned sharply towards her. You beggar. She lunged forward, bringing her hand in for a punch. Jonathan intercepted her wrist. Don't you dare. Security. 2 stout men in suits entered the office. Show my wife out, Jonathan said tiredly, and make sure she doesn't leave the house until the investigators arrive. You're going to regret this. Caroline hissed as she was led out of the office. You'll remember me again, you Chinese scum. This was already addressed to Amy. When the door closed, there was a heavy silence in the office. Jonathan sank abruptly into his chair, covering his face with his hands. My God, how could I have been so blind? Amy quietly approached him and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. You weren't blind. You just believe the best in people. That's not a flaw. It's a gift. He raised his eyes to her, full of pain and gratitude. Thank you for everything. If it weren't for you, dawn would come soon enough. The new day promised to be difficult. There was much to explain to the Chinese partners, deal with the police, save the company's reputation, but somehow they both felt that the worst was over. It wasn't long before Caroline, slimmed down and gaunt, was leaving the luxurious mansion in Los Angeles with 2 suitcases. Everything that had been bought with her husband's money had to be left behind. She cast one last glance at the second-floor windows where her quarters had once been and grinned evilly. But even that grin was a pale shadow of her former arrogance. The divorce had been swift, the evidence of financial fraud leaving no chance for compromise. Now the former socialite, released on her own recognizance, was waiting for a rented flat in a cheap neighborhood, long proceedings with the investigators and the court. Meanwhile, the company was celebrating the successful completion of the Chinese deal. Upon hearing about Caroline's situation, Mr. Lee only shook his head understandingly. In our country, they say when heaven wants to punish a man, it takes away his mind. Amy translated his words. She was now the director of international projects. Her natural modesty hadn't gone away, but there was a certain confidence. It was as if she had finally found her place in life. Jonathan had changed too. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted off his shoulders. A younger man. He stayed late at the office more and more often, and Amy kept him company. They talked about work, about life, about the past and the future. One evening, as the two of them were going over the paperwork for a new project, Jonathan suddenly asked, "Do you like Italian food?" Amy looked up in surprise. "Yes, why do you ask?" "It's just," he faltered, and for the first time there was a note of excitement in his unwavering voice. "It's just that I know a great Italian restaurant, and I've wanted to invite you for a long time, not as a colleague." A soft, warm smile appeared on her lips, and the sadness that had lived in them all these years melted in her eyes. "I agree." Outside the window, the sunset was burning down, coloring the sky in soft pink tones. Somewhere in the distance, evening Los Angeles was buzzing, and a cozy, warm silence hung in the office, the kind that only happens between two people who have found each other after a long ordeal in life. Thank you for watching the video to the end. That's all for today. Give this video a thumbs up if you found the story interesting and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. See you soon.